the study of conversion and interreligious encounters here at Beersheba. I'll try and be brief with my welcoming notes. My name is Ephraim Shoham. I'm the director of the center. I'm the second director of the center. Seated next to me is the founder, Professor Chaim Hames, who's also director of our university, and that's why I'm sitting in the director's chair, because one cannot see it both. So it's a pleasure to have you all here around this table for what seems to be like a wonderful opportunity for a stimulating, insightful, and very high-level scholarly discussion for the next few days. I'm glad to welcome all the participants that came all the way from Oxford with Professor Sapir Abulafia and the members of the Seminar for the Study of the Abrahamic Religions. It was only fitting that the first joint workshop of the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters with our Oxford University partners will focus on the topic of sacred spaces and holy places, and that it will take place here at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba, a site associated with the Abrahamic tradition, something we will come to again shortly in a few moments. As you will see when we go on our field trip on Wednesday, we're just a short drive from some of the most intriguing, contested, and inspirational places deemed holy and sacred by so many millions around the world, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. But before we delve into content, I would like to also invoke a saying from the chapters of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, a compilation of ethical teachings and maxims passed down by the rabbis from the first century. The quote is, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, if there is no flour, there is no Torah. Im en kemach, en Torah. And one of the possible meanings of this maxim is that with the absence of material assistance, the spiritual and lofty teachings of Torah cannot be sustained. So before we continue, I would like to refer you to the first line of our program. It says, in memory of Michel Halperin, and I'd like to say just a few words about who Michel Halperin was and how he helped this gathering come to being. Michel Halperin was a brilliant lawyer and was loved by and respected by leaders in his hometown of Geneva. He was a long-serving member of the Geneva Parliament and its chair in 2006. Michel was also a charismatic advocate of human rights and an active member of many nonprofit organizations. Most notably, he was the co-founder of the UN Watch and the chairman of the Swiss Human Rights Watch. He was born to a prominent Jewish family and became a staunch supporter of Israel very early on. His deep commitment to the Jewish people and his generosity, combined with his passion for the advancement of higher education in Israel, led him to become a devoted friend of the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. He served as president of the Association of Swiss Friends of BGU for 25 years with his wife, Estelle, and they were particularly committed to BGU students and did much to support them through what they called the Moshe Fund. Michel Halperin passed away 5 years ago at the very young age of 65, leaving behind his wife Esther and 3 children. The Halperin family is dedicated to interfaith dialogue based on scholarship and the belief that deeper knowledge and of one another may aid in reducing interfaith tensions and inspiring understanding. Steering shared history and values between, or stressing shared values and history between all 3 Abrahamic faiths. The Halperin Foundation helped us in facilitating this workshop and the next one that will hopefully take place in Oxford next year. Beersheba is not a holy or sacred place in the religious sense of the word. In the past, it serves as a rallying point for those who wish to go on the quest to the holy places, either heading down to Mecca and Medina or ascending up the hills to Jerusalem. Sometimes it was the stepping stone for the final attack on the heartland of the Holy Land, serving as a gateway to the holy cities of Hebron and ultimately Jerusalem, like during the campaign of autumn 1917, when British imperial troops, led by General Allenby, came through Beersheba en route to conquering Jerusalem in December of that year. Beersheba is most certainly a very good point, however, for the departure on a journey or a quest to seek a better understanding of what sacred places are, what they signify and to whom, how they operate and change over time. what rituals and cultic activities take place in it, and what acts are thought to be sacrilegious and unholy, and how these definitions change over time. What forces and social groups were and are interested in the places and spaces deemed sacred and hallowed, and why some sites are elevated to sanctity and become contested ground to different groups, while others lose their original significance and fall into obscurity. All these and other questions we intend to explore both here in the air-conditioned workshop hall of BGU, as well as on the ground on Wednesday, and brace yourself, it's going to be very hot on Wednesday in Jerusalem. Although Jerusalem is famed for its wind and its mild climate, it's going to be piping hot, so be prepared. We're going to be led by our colleague, Professor Jackie Feldman. Jackie is one of the Center for the Study of Conversion steering committee members. He's an anthropologist and a scholar of pilgrimage and tourism, as well as a licensed tour guide, and he kind of combines both of his traits. Jackie and Dr. Yamit Shrira, Rahman Shrira, one of our postdocs, and an expert on medieval Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land, will take us and explore some of the holy sites in Jerusalem in what promises to be a fascinating scholarly experience. As I mentioned, Beersheba, although associated with the Patriarch Abraham, never became a holy or sacred space or in and of itself. This may be owed to the fact that Abraham's figure is extremely nomadic. He's a wanderer, a man on the move, signified by the Hebrew words lech lecha. Get thee out of thy country. That's the first commandment God gives Abraham in Genesis 12. You may be aware of the fact that not too far from here, on the banks of the local large wadi, Nachal Beersheba, there's an ancient well. Very similar in design and use to many such wells that riddled the south of Israel, that was once part of the vast wilderness of the Negev and the Sinai deserts, thinly populated by the nomadic Bedouin tribes. In the 19th century, British explorer and Orientalist Henry Baker Tristram had made note of this well in his travelogue, referring to it as Abraham's well, reiterating local, what he said was local Bedouin tradition, probably amplified by his own Christian biblical upbringing, and the fact that it was located in and around an area known as Beersheba, a place associated with the three biblical patriarchs. Later on, in 1874, Lieutenant Claude Renier-Condor, and a Royal Engineering Corps officer working for the Palestine Exploration Fund, the PEF, along with another Royal Engineer, Captain Charles Warren, were part of a mapping mission that produced the very fine Warren-Condor 1876 PEF maps of this area. They had visited the well and found a medieval inscription in Arabic dating at least one of the maintenance efforts in preserving the well to the year 1112. It is assumed that the inscription and the maintenance efforts more than 900 years ago were conducted during the futile campaigns led by the Fatimid Caliphate to try and overthrow the Frankish conquest of the region in 1099, known in Western historiography as the First Crusade. The biblical link to the Patriarch Abraham, who according to tradition dwelt here, dug the wells here, and it was from here that he set out to his 3-day decisive journey with his son Isaac to Mount Moriah, described in detail in Genesis 22, inspired the 19th century British explorer's imagination. When Beersheba had become part of the State of Israel in 1948, the well area and the Ottoman Khan next to it were designated by authorities as historical sites worth of preservation, and it was decided not to build on this site and not develop it for civil use, but rather as a historical site. But gradually, as in many post-colonial nation states, Israel being no exception, the site fell into disrepair. It was only in 1979, exactly 40 years ago, that Israel's authorities had decided to infuse this site with yet another set of symbols. In Genesis 21, just before the biblical narrative tells about the binding of Isaac in chapter 22, we read that Beersheba is the site of a covenant made between the patriarch Abraham and the Philistine local chieftain Avimelech near the well. The covenant, or the pact, was designed to end a few rounds of local nomadic cycles of violence, which will be our subject for next year, between Abraham and Abimelech's shepherds over water sources in the desert, something that constantly occurs until this very day. Beersheba's name is explained twice in this section of Genesis as a site of a symbolic act performed by Abraham setting aside 7 sheep, Sheva, as a symbol of his attempt to draw the local tribal chieftain into signing the covenant. The word Sheva in Hebrew stands for both the number 7 and the act of the oath, Shvu'ah. In May 1979, as part of his second visit to Israel, following the official signing of the peace accord between Israel and Egypt in March of 1979, President Anwar Sadat visited Beersheba. He visited Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and he visited Abraham's well. The arrival at Abraham's well was designed symbolically to signify and resonate the biblical well of Beersheba as a meeting place or a middle ground between the two leaders, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, where peace was and will be and is struck between warring fractions in the region and the supposed descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael. So with these symbols in mind, and after offering some facts about the place that we are meeting at, I think we should start, and I will ask Harvey, Professor Chaim Hames, director of our university, to say a few words. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the university. Welcome particularly to those who have come all the way from Oxford to what the person who the university is called after, David Ben-Gurion, who was the first Prime Minister of Israel. His dream was to create, and he writes this in his diary, the Oxford of the Negev. Okay, so you're really home. You're already home away from home. Okay. You haven't traveled very far, and we're delighted to have you here. We have slightly less than 800 years of tradition. We're coming up to our 50th anniversary next year. And it's a great pleasure to have you here. It's especially a pleasure for me to have sitting, aside from Effie, of course, which is also very nice, but to have Anna, Professor Anna Sapir Abulafia sitting at the table, because I probably wouldn't be here without Anna's input, support, help, advice, God knows what, many years ago when I was a PhD student in Cambridge, and my official supervisor was someone called David Abulafia, who has a connection with someone called Anna Sapir Abulafia, and it was brilliant for me that my PhD topic really, or my research, really touched on both David's expertise and Anna's expertise. So I got 2 for the price of 1, and thank goodness, I'm delighted to say that our friendship has continued over the years, and it is really a great pleasure for me and for us to be able to cooperate with you now at Oxford, but that's okay. That's not the end of the world. And to be able to cooperate together, and what I hope will be the first of many such meetings. So the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters was set up in 2013. And the idea behind it was to, we actually were funded for the first 5 years by the Council for Higher Education because the center was set up as part of what the Israeli government wanted to stop the brain drain, right, of young Israeli researchers going abroad, and they decided that one of the ways to do this would be to set up centers of research excellence. Of course, almost all of them were set up in the sciences, because why would the humanities need centers of research excellence? But within the pool, there was an opportunity for 2 centers in the humanities, and I thought it would be, and I had I had a dream. I thought that setting up a center like this would be able to show how much, even in the humanities, where people's idea, all you need is a library and your computer, or before computer, just your pen and paper, and you are well away, right? You could do your own research. But what I thought it would be interesting to show that how, even in the humanities, when scholars are able to sit together, right, and meet and talk, right, all the time, not just when they meet in the library or tea room, right? But the Oxford doesn't have a tea room, does it? No, that's one of the in the Bodleian. No, that's one of the. But in the tea room or wherever else, actually being able to sit together, working on your own stuff, but being able to discuss, talk, collaborate with people working on totally different things, would be incredibly would bring about great, be good for everyone's research. And I think that over the past few years, and around this table, sitting a number of people who have been associated with the center since its inception, and are still involved and are still coming back, even though they're not perhaps officially part of the center anymore. I think we've shown over the past few years how in the humanities, we're also able, through collaboration, to do much, much better academic work, and it's a great pleasure for me, right, that the center is continuing beyond the 5 years. I should have to say something about that. The center was originally funded for 5 years, and we didn't want the center to die after 5 years. So before I became what I am now, I was working very hard to persuade the university, the university administration that it was worth their while to continue funding the center. And from a very inauspicious beginning with the administration, the only conversion that this center has ever done, or ever achieved, is converting the administration of this university from being very anti to being very positive the center, and we've actually guaranteed 4 more years of funding, which is really nice, and which enables us to continue with the great work that we're doing. I always get asked, by the way, if we do conversions by people, and I say that not yet. Right? We might come down, we might charge, and that might help. That might allow us to be able to continue our work, a conversion fee. Yeah, but we're not there. We're not yet there. So I'm delighted that this collaboration is happening, and I hope that the next few days, I'm sure, are going to be very, very exciting. Sadly, because of my stupidity, in the sense of running for this, of being elected rector, I have to do other things. But I hope to be here as much as possible, and I look forward to hearing the dialogue, not just the papers, but the conversations that go on both at the table and beyond. And I should say, something really, really important for us at the center, and for me in general as an academic, is food. Okay, I think food really, really helps make an academic, make a conference, make any academic gathering much more interesting and relaxed, and so we put a lot of effort and a lot of attention on the food, as you will see. So eat. Okay. Tonight you'll also be able to drink. Okay, and I'm not talking about water and whatever else. I'm talking about other things.
Don't drop the ball.
Right? And be merry. Seriously, it's an opportunity to meet, to talk, to engage with each other, to exchange ideas. And we've already seen how out of these conferences come incredibly interesting research projects. And I'm sure that's going to happen again. I want to, in conclusion, to thank both Effie for taking on the center and doing such a good job of running it. You might not know this, but well, some of you do. But sitting behind is, first of all, is Bat-El, okay, who is the right administrator of the center.
First mother superior.
Right. First mother, who she basically is here, has been here from the day it started, and has been the administrator. She is no longer at the center because I felt that if I was moving elsewhere, she had to move with me, and so Bat-El is now running the university rather than the center. And I also want to thank, so first of all, thank you to Bat-El for all the years that she devoted to I also want to thank Raya, who you might not meet, right? But many of you might have got emails from over the. She was supposed to give birth in a couple of weeks' time, but she decided to give birth early, or the baby decided that it was time to come into the world. So she gave birth last week, and I have to say that her dedication is such that after giving 2 or 3 days after giving birth, right, she actually came here to help to make sure that everything was running okay. And instead of Raya, right, we have Shirin. Sorry, I'm sorry. Who has taken over, and I'm sure will, if you have any problems or any questions or anything, will help you. So let's enjoy the next couple of days: companionship, scholarship, food. Right? And we look forward to welcoming you back here again. Thank you.
So I very much want to thank Harvey and Bat-El and Effie and Raya and Amitai and all the others who have made our travels go so very, very smoothly. And I must say, to have Effie at the other side of WhatsApp asking, have you arrived safely? Yes, we have. This is the name of your driver. Very nice, very, very nice, and we very much appreciate it. I just want to say a few words about the Abrahamic Seminar. So we've heard about the Conversion Center, but just so that people have a sense of where the Oxford group is coming from. So I took up my chair, which is the study of the Abrahamic religions, which is a bit of a mouthful, in 2015, and was immediately challenged in the Faculty of Theology and Religion, not only by the word religion, what is religion, and that Abrahamic was a nonsense as well. So that was a really, really good experience. So I inherited from my predecessor, Guy Strumza, the Abrahamic Seminar. And without going into all kinds of details, when I took it over, I had a very clear idea what I wanted to do with it. What I wanted to do with it was to bring together, certainly within the Faculty of Theology and Religion, students from all of the different areas in the faculty, and so that those students, together with students from other faculties in the, what we call the division of humanities division, to come together and to think together about really difficult issues. I believe really important to put on agendas the really, really hard ones. So the first seminar, and I think, Stephen, I know you were there, but I think you are the only... No, Lorraine, of course, yes. You hide under Jeana, but you are Lorraine. It's Lorraine, see, you were master students then, weren't you? Absolutely, absolutely. And so I thought, well, let's start with blood. And we actually talked about the role of blood in the Abrahamic religions and had some very frank discussions about that. The next year, I ventured into conversion, because I also am very interested in conversion, and that was extremely interesting. We then went to tolerance and toleration, and this year we're on sacred spaces. And when I say that cross-faculty within theology and religion, we have people here from Christian ethics, people from ecclesiastical history, science and religion, the study of religions. We also have classicists, people from the English faculty. We have historians as well. And for me, all of this is very important because our faculty, being called theology and religion, we are doing something, I think, in Oxford, which is a bit special. Because we encourage our students, and also we as researchers, we encourage each other not just to do what is religious studies, but to mix in with that also theology, but increasingly not thinking, when the word theology is used, just about Christian theology, but very much the realization, whatever other traditions might call it, and let's not go down that route, but that it isn't all Christian, and that within the Abrahamic field, of course, Islam and Judaism, and of course there isn't just one Islam and one Judaism, one Christian. We all know of that, very, very important, but also in the bit of the faculty where I organize things, I suppose, there's Buddhism and Hinduism as well, and very, very strongly represented. And I think in terms of what's going on in the world today, I really, really do believe that from whatever position you come, it is fruitful and it is empowering to think about other traditions, because you learn so much more about your own traditions, and this is us all as human beings, we're human beings and scholars. But in terms of our scholarly work, and I know that through my own work, it makes such a difference to be confronted with ideas and methodologies from other areas. It really, really, I think, makes us all into better researchers. So when it comes to our group, what I really, really like is that people are coming here thinking about sacred spaces from the viewpoint of their own research, their own DPhil work. So the Oxford group, we're all DPhil students. Some have just started their research, others have done many years of research, and they are looking at their particular aspect of their research, and they're asking themselves, what does this mean if I think about my research through the lens of sacred spaces in the Abrahamic religions? And for me, that's been incredibly exciting to see what the group has come up with. So I'll close by saying yet again how delighted we all are to be here, and yes, to be here with you, Harvey. My goodness, for me it's very, very special. And to sit here, you here, I mean, you know, when we started talking, you were Dean of your, what was it, Dean of Humanities, and that was pretty grand. But now you're not just that, you're rector of the whole university. So wonderful to be with you, and it's great to be here. Thank you.
We move to our first session. Catalin, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Shall we go?
If you want to use the podium, please.
Thank you. to our first panel, Theology. My name is CATALIN-STEFAN and I'm a postdoc fellow at the Center for the Study of Conversion in Interreligious Encounters here at the Ben-Gurion University. It is my pleasure to chair this first section of our conference together with Professor CANA WARMAN, who is the respondent of the session. First of all, I would introduce Professor WARMAN. She is a professor in the Department of Jewish History at Ben-Gurion University. Her fields of interest is Second Temple Judaism, Second Temple literature, early Christianity, and ancient Judaism. So it is our honor to moderate this session. We have 3 speakers from the University of Oxford. Every speaker has 20 minutes at his or at her disposal to present the paper, and additionally we have 10 minutes for questions. Please keep in mind that you have to keep the time. Our first speaker is Jeana Ferguson. Jeana is a doctoral candidate in classical languages and literature at University of Oxford. Her dissertation is titled Grace No Longer Grace, a Theology of Pauline Charis in the World of the Early Principate. Jeana received her bachelor degree in Greek and Latin from Hillsdale College, Michigan, and her master's degree in Greek and Latin languages and literature from St. Hugh's College, Oxford. Jeana, the floor is yours.
Okay.
No.
Is this the one I'm supposed to use?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kathleen. Good morning, everyone. Just before I start, I want to thank our very gracious hosts for their very warm welcome to us this morning. And just to clarify, my name, as Anna suggested, is very confusing. I actually go by Lorraine, so that's what my name tag says, despite basically everything else on the program. My talk today is titled The Body, the Temple, and the Ekklēsia, Sacred Space in 1 Corinthians. In his first letter to the first century Christian community at Corinth, the Apostle Paul locates sacrality in 3 prominent spaces: the human body, the temple, and the Ekklēsia, which is the gathering of a local Christian community. This paper addresses the question of what makes these 3 spaces sacred for Paul. I hope to show that in his treatment of each of them, Paul focuses his attention and that of his audience on the concept of shared space, both whom the space is shared with and what is shared within it. These 2 questions define the sacrality of space for Paul, and, as we shall see at the end of this paper, they serve as the grounding for his vision of the temple function of the Ekklēsia as the communal body of Christ. Paul wrote the letter that we now call 1 Corinthians in the spring of either 53, 54, or 55 AD, apparently from Ephesus in the Roman province of Asia. He had previously spent 18 months living with the Corinthians and helping to establish the Christian community there. Despite its modern title, Paul's letter indicates that it is not the first that he has sent to them, but is rather part of an ongoing correspondence, most of which has been lost. Recent work by scholars such as Kathleen Troost-Kramer has documented the variety of ways in which religious communities of Paul's time established a sense of temple-like sanctity in local places of meeting and prayer. Troost-Kramer cites various quotations from the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, which use sacrificial language to create what she calls rather fluid images. To quote her, "The Yachad offers the sacrifice of an upright life, or works of the Torah, therefore its members act as priests. They also are themselves the sacrifice, which is portrayed as both a sin offering and a free will offering. The community is also the temple, where the acceptable sacrifices of perfectly Torah-observant living are offered. So Truce-Kramer further points out that in the Qumranic case, sacrificial language is used in order to portray the holiness of the local community as a replacement for the Jerusalem temple institution and all its functions. Across the diaspora, however, we see similar language used to express the extension of temple holiness to local synagogue communities. Practices such as almsgiving, Sabbath fasting, purity law observance, and the temple tax are regularly spoken of as ways in which diaspora Jewish communities can metaphorically continue to perform and participate in cultic sacrifice despite their geographic distance from the temple at Jerusalem. Notably, for our discussion of Paul's primarily Gentile community at Corinth, Truce-Kramer and Stephen Fine both argue that the Jewish conception of places dedicated to prayer and the reading of Scripture as equal in holiness to the temple was likely influenced by the fact that in the surrounding Greco-Roman culture, any individual deity is allowed limitless numbers of temples. Paul undoubtedly has this assumption in mind when he writes to the Corinthian believers that they too are a temple of the Christian God, as are, by implication, the other Ekklēsiae across the Roman world that he refers to at various points throughout his letter. Unlike so many of his diasporic contemporaries, however, in his letter to the Corinthians, Paul does not primarily treat ethical behavior, or prayer, or the reading of Scripture, as the means by which a space takes on temple-like sanctity. Instead, he carefully develops an understanding of the sacredness of the body and the Christian Ekklēsia that then serves as the groundwork for his ethical instruction. For Paul, the sacrality of a space is defined by whom the space is shared with and what is shared within it. And the ethics of how one treats a sacred space spring from the conception of that space as one that is shared, primarily as one that is shared with the divine, but as with any temple, a concept of vertical sharing with the divine also has implications for how the space is shared horizontally with other human beings. So let's look first at Paul's discussion of the human body in order to see how he develops this idea of both vertically and horizontally shared sacred space. Paul's letter to the Corinthians addresses a number of specific problems that they have raised in their previous letter or letters to him. Several of these problems relate to sexual ethics. Paul addresses in turn a case of incest, engagement in prostitution, which was likely temple prostitution in the Corinthian context, and various misunderstandings concerning sexual relations within marriage. In relation to the question of having sex with a prostitute, Paul becomes quite vehement. So he says, "Don't you know that your bodies are the limbs of Christ? Shall I then take the limbs of Christ and make them the limbs of a prostitute? Never. Or don't you know that the one joined to a prostitute is one body with her? For as it says, the two will become one flesh. But the one joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. So run away from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the one committing sexual immorality sins against his own body. Or don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit among you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? For you were purchased at a price. So honor God in your body." Note here that the logic of Paul's argument does not run, sanctify your body by offering up the sacrifice of sexual purity, which would more closely resemble, for instance, the arguments Truce-Kramer summarizes from Qumran. Rather, Paul insists that the body is sacred because it has been joined to Christ by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. The body is now the temple or dwelling place of the Spirit which the Corinthians have received from God, and it is now what he calls a limb of Christ's own body. The Christian body has become a sacred space because it is no longer an individual body, but is in some way shared with and possessed by the divine. For that reason, Paul writes, it cannot be shared with a prostitute, because such an act would essentially be the joining of Christ to a prostitute. Paul is, of course, drawing the content of his sexual ethic from the teaching of Torah, as we see from his quotation from Genesis, the two will become one flesh. To refuse to respect that teaching is to desecrate the sanctity of the body as he has described it. But in the first instance, it is not the individual's obedience to that ethic that designates the space of the body as sacred. The sanctity of the Christian body is grounded on the fact that it is a space shared with the divine, like a temple. So speaking of temples, this is the temple of Apollo at ancient Corinth, for a little bit of context, as it currently stands. So later in his letter, Paul uses a similar line of reasoning to explain to his addressees why he does not want them participating in the idol feasts held in the pagan temples that surround them in Corinth. As the Christian body is a space shared vertically with Christ, and therefore cannot be shared horizontally with a prostitute, so in a pagan temple, Paul reasons, the sacrificial meal is shared vertically with what he calls demons, and it therefore cannot be shared horizontally by those who belong to Christ. So he writes, "Are not those who eat the sacrifices sharers in the sacrificial altar? What do I mean then? That the thing offered to idols is anything in itself? Or that an idol is anything in itself? No. Instead, I mean that what they sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be sharers with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot share in the table of the Lord and the table of demons." Unlike many of his Jewish contemporaries, Paul is not particularly concerned with the halakhic pollution that may be incurred either by physical contact with the actual meat sacrificed to the pagan gods or by the sight of their images. We might contrast, for instance, the terror of Philo's legates at the prospect of seeing a pagan idol placed in the temple at Jerusalem some 10 or 15 years before Paul was writing. The Jewish legates in Philo's On the Embassy to Gaius invoke the ancient myth of the Gorgon to try and express to Petronius how disastrous the sight of an idolatrous statue would be for them. They say, "We have heard a very ancient tale handed down throughout Greece by learned men, who affirmed that the head of the Gorgon had such great power that those who looked upon it immediately turned into stones and rocks. Do you suppose, may it never be, that if any of our own should see this statue being escorted into our temple, they would not be changed into rocks, their joints frozen and their eyes too, so that they might not even be able to move, their entire bodies, every part and system, losing all their natural motions?" Philo's legates speak perhaps in hyperbole here, but their point is clear. The sight of a pagan idol is defiling, even deadly, and their logic is echoed among other contemporary Jewish authors that we don't have time to look at today. But if we return instead to Paul's argument against idolatry in the Corinthian context, we see that his logic differs significantly. Paul answers with an emphatic negative his own question, is the thing offered to idols anything in itself, or is an idol anything in itself? Elsewhere in the letter, Paul encourages the Corinthians that they need not worry about halakhic pollution if they accidentally buy and eat meat sold in the marketplace that had previously been offered to an idol. And Paul nowhere forbids his addressees from viewing the idolatrous image housed in a pagan temple. Instead, what is crucial for Paul, and what is absolutely forbidden, is the sacrificial feast itself, which he calls a sharing with demons. While the idol and the food are in themselves nothing, the act of sharing a sacrificial meal makes both the meat itself and the temple space sacred to the pagan god, and therefore off limits for Paul's Christian addressees. Notably, however, in this discussion of the pagan rite that the Corinthians must eschew, Paul has helpfully highlighted for us two of the most important functions of a temple as his primarily Gentile audience would understand them. First, the temple is the location for the image of the god. And second, it is the place where a communal meal is shared in honor of that god. Towards the end of his letter to the Corinthians, Paul develops some of his richest imagery for sacred space to demonstrate that the Ekklēsia, the local gathering of Christian believers, is now the primary sacred space in which these two temple functions are to be fulfilled. Like a human body or a temple, the Ekklēsia too is defined by two important things that are shared within it. The first is, of course, the Eucharist, which Paul explicitly names as the reason why his Corinthian addressees cannot participate in meals sacred to pagan demons. So looking back, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot share in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Just prior to this